February 2nd this year marked the 79th anniversary of the end of the Battle of Stalingrad, the largest and the bloodiest battle the world has ever seen. As the Soviet and Axis powers fought for control of the city, the vicious urban conflict became a meat grinder, with around 2 million casualties, including civilians, caused by the end of the 5-month battle. Historians are in no doubt that Stalingrad was a key turning point in World War II, if not the main turning point. Nazi Germany suffered the complete loss of its greatest, largest and the most battle-hardened army, the Sixth Army, and the defeat marked the end of German expansion eastwards. From that point onwards, the Third Reich was fighting a defensive war. A chink in the armor of the supposedly unstoppable Nazi war machine had been exposed, boosting Allied morale. However, what if that pivotal moment in World War II had ended differently? What if Stalingrad had fallen? How would the war have then played out? Here are 4 different scenarios that might have occurred. The war drags on a little longer, but with the same result. So Stalingrad has fallen and the Germans have conquered the city, but at what cost? In our timeline, Germany suffered 80% of its casualties during World War II on the Eastern Front. A good portion of those at Stalingrad, around 850,000 casualties, along with a vast amount of military equipment. It was the single biggest defeat in the history of the German army, and the battle took a hefty toll on the Nazi cause. In any scenario in which the German army takes Stalingrad, the bloody street-to-street combat ensures the Germans will suffer great losses, impacting the effectiveness at which it can continue to carry out its eastern offensive. With Stalingrad behind them, the Germans now stagger on towards the oil fields of Baku, in Caucasus, one of the main objectives of the 1942 summer offensive into southern Russia, known as Case Blue. The vast majority of Germany's oil comes from Romania, but stocks are running low, meaning the Soviet oil fields are extremely important for Hitler's war efforts. However, the Soviets destroy the oil production facilities during their retreat. In all likelihood, it will take the Germans somewhere between 1 to 2 years to repair these facilities and have them producing the fuel that the mechanized Nazi war machine so desperately craves. Even if the Germans can get the oil fields up and running quicker than a year, their already overstretched supply lines will be pushed to the limit. They'd have to build, secure, and protect a route that the oil could be transported along, connecting the Caucasus all the way back to the west. Although the Soviets have lost Stalingrad, they still vastly outnumber the Germans, and their strong resistance continues. They target German supply lines, especially those carrying oil, and make a number of attempts to retake Stalingrad. Hitler's belief that Slavs are subhuman and his policy of complete annihilation means his forces gain little favor from various nations or non-Russians within the Soviet Union, who no longer see the Nazis as liberators but instead take up arms against them. Without the immediate benefit of the oil fields combined with the sheer size and logistical complexity of Russia, defending the Caucasus stretches the Wehrmacht beyond its limits. Although delayed, the outcome of the war remains the same as in our timeline, with Germany eventually retreating from Russia and losing the war. The Eastern Front becomes a stalemate. The Nazis still lose the war. Although the first scenario is perhaps the most likely, with any what-if questions, the various answers depend on the assumptions that you make. So let's assume in this scenario that the Germans managed to take Stalingrad with relative ease, or in fact bypass the city completely, deciding to engage in mobile warfare instead, a tactic at which they excel. So, with Stalingrad behind them and the Sixth Army still intact, the Germans confidently advance towards their main goal, the oil fields in the Caucasus. Although the Soviets leave little for the Germans to utilize in the short term, the German acquisition of the oil fields means that the Soviets have been cut off from their main supply of oil, around 86%. The importing of land-lease material from the US to the USSR via Iran, known as the Persian Corridor, has also been significantly reduced. With plenty of manpower still at their disposal, the German army continues pushing east. As per the first scenario though, the supply line situation remains the Achilles heel for the German army. Without also having the time and money to invest in upgrading the transportation network in Russia, the small amount of resources the Germans can extract from the Caucasus proves to be of little help in keeping their war machine fed. However, with the Soviets now being starved of oil and with no great propaganda victory at Stalingrad, morale is at an all-time low in Russia. In the immediate term, the Soviets are unable to shift the Germans from their country, but Germans are unable to inflict the killer blow to the Soviets due to logistics and supply. Instead, a stalemate ensues. Over the coming months or years, German manpower and resources are worn thin through its defense of the Caucasus and the attempts to move further east. With Moscow still in Soviet hands, Stalin continues to orchestrate attacks on the German forces. With Germany still fighting a war on two fronts, in the end, it becomes too much to bear. Russia bleeds the Germans dry, whilst the Western allies apply the final blow. The Soviets surrender, but the Western allies hold firm. In many scenarios, it is hard to envisage Nazi Germany ever defeating the Soviet Union in the way Hitler wanted: complete extermination. However, if we replay scenario 2 again, but this time Germany manages to fight its way to the oil fields in the Caucasus fast enough to take them intact, then there is a chance they could force a Soviet surrender. With no heavy losses at Stalingrad, Germany still have the battle-hardened troops available to continue their expansion eastwards. They now also have fully operational oil refineries at their disposal, whilst the Soviets would be cut off from their main supplies. It's a big if, but if that did happen, the Soviet army would be in serious trouble and unlikely to continue repelling the German advances for long. With Soviet morale continuing to fall, Stalin's position at the top could be in jeopardy. If any sort of civil war breaks out, the Germans would of course be the beneficiaries. So let's say the Soviets are now forced to sue for peace. With a significant military power now out of the war and the vast resources of the country at the disposal of the Germans, millions of soldiers and thousands of aircraft and tanks fighting on the Eastern Front are now freed up to be used elsewhere. However, Germany's path to overall victory is far from done. Constant uprisings in Russia plague the Third Reich whilst it struggles to immerse the country into its empire. Most importantly though, the UK and US are still in the war, and ultimately the success of the American Manhattan Project is the downfall of Nazi Germany. With the atomic bomb being dropped at a number of German cities, the Nazi regime, just like the Japanese before them, is forced to sue for peace. The Nazis conquer Europe and win the war. Although it is the worst possibility of them all, it is perhaps the least likely. A lot of chips needed to land in Hitler's favor for Nazi Germany to have won the war, but that doesn't mean historians haven't calculated ways in which it could have been done. Stalingrad, it seems, was one such sliding doors moment, a battle that could put Germany on a path to overall victory. Even at the time, the world understood the significance of the bloody urban conflict. Following on from the previous scenario, Stalingrad has fallen with little loss of German life. The Caucasus oil fields have been taken intact and Russia has sued for peace, freeing up a vast amount of German troops to head for other fronts, including North Africa. Finally being given the manpower and resources he's been carrying out for Field Marshal Rommel, the Desert Fox turns the tide in North Africa in Germany's favor. Soon, Egypt falls, cutting Britain off from its vital Mediterranean transport route. The Middle East follows suit. Britain has now lost its oil. German resources are shifted to the Atlantic, putting even more pressure on British supply lines. With large amounts of German manpower moved from the Eastern to the Western Front, the Allied invasion of France, D-Day, does not occur. Huge numbers of aircraft are released from the Soviet conflict, meaning the Germans can undertake a second Battle of Britain, and this time the Luftwaffe takes control of the skies. A land invasion comes next, and Britain falls. Whilst America still prevails in the Pacific and the Manhattan Project is a success, the US has lost the ability to launch its bombers from the British airfields, meaning Germany remains out of reach of US atomic bombs. Europe is now fallen. With the resources of Russia now at their disposal, Nazi Germany becomes a global superpower. The US and Germany reach a peace agreement, potentially heralding in an alternative Cold War, but this time played out between the Americans and the Nazis. Whether or not Stalingrad could have won the war for Germany is up for interpretation, but one thing is for certain: losing it cost them the war. In the next video, we will investigate the Nazis' nuclear plans and the scenarios that would happen if the Germans got the atomic bomb. So consider to subscribe so you won't lose our future videos.